but it's my pleasure to welcome you today. My name is Ken Ferraro. I'm director of the Center on Aging in the Life course, and I want to welcome you to our symposium, Changes in Wellbeing and Health After a Transition to Family Caregiving. I want to say a special welcome to faculty associates and students. I see some alums out there. It's wonderful to have you back. I also want to recognize some guests from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Indiana University. So we're delighted that you could join us today. A special recognition to our three new faculty associates that joined us in 2021. Those are Nadia Brazier and Sydney Trask from Psychological Sciences, and then Rosie Shrout from Human Development and Family Studies. We're delighted that you joined Purdue. Each year, millions of families make a decision about family caregiving, and the prevalence of HR departments offering a program for support for care of elders is one indication of the gravity of the issue. Some of you may have been a part of a family that was involved in such a transition. Others of you are in it right now, and several of you may be thinking of us as something that you're going to anticipate in the years ahead. Well, that's the focus of this symposium, a scientific approach to this transition as people adopt new caregiving roles. I want you to kindly mute yourself unless you're speaking so that we can eliminate any ambient noises. And then please use the chat session for our time for Q&A after our speaker. The way that will work is you can just send it to Paige Ebner, who's our assistant director of the center, and she will cue everyone for a question. You can do it one of two ways. Either you can type out your question for our speaker, or you can simply say, I have a question. And then that way she'll have a queue of those who are interested in having questions. At the conclusion of the Q&A session, please join us for recognition for two of our colleagues for outstanding engagement work. So I'm going to call my colleague, Professor Melissa Franks, to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to get to make this introduction of Dr. William Haley for this year's CALC Symposium. And I want to send out my thanks to the Center on Aging in the Life course for inviting Bill to be here with us today. Dr. Haley is a professor in the School of Aging Studies at the University of South Florida. He has been at USF since 1995. And if I'm correct, I think you were the initial director of that School of Aging Studies. Yeah. And for over 3 decades, his research has focused on family caregiving with an emphasis on dementia caregiving in diverse families. And according to his University of South Florida faculty website, which I've been studying, he has more than 160 published papers. And if you take just a quick look across this list of publications, it shows that he is a very active collaborator with a broad spectrum of colleagues. And since I was given just a few minutes to make this introduction, I won't be able to give you the full list of his many professional accomplishments and recognitions. But I do want to draw your attention to his professional contributions, in addition to his longstanding and outstanding program of aging research. Bill has a stellar record of teaching and mentoring. He has received multiple mentoring awards from professional organizations, including GSA and APA. And he's also been recognized multiple times as an outstanding teacher at University of South Florida. And as many of you may know, I have known Bill for nearly all of my academic career, and I can assure you that his passion and enthusiasm for aging research is unmatched. And his interest in the careers of students and young professionals is inspiring. And I certainly can understand the teaching awards, looking at the list of courses that he has taught at University of South Florida. I'm ready to sign up for some courses myself. I also want to mention that Bill has generously shared his expertise and passion to advanced aging research at both APA and GSA. He has served in several of the top leadership roles in each of these professional organizations. Currently, he is the chair of the Committee on Aging at APA. Across his academic career, Bill has made significant contributions to the fields of psychology and aging, and particularly to research focused on aging families. I'm excited to have this opportunity to introduce Bill to our CALC community and to learn more about his current research on the transition to caregiving. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks so much, Melissa. What a gracious invitation. Let me get my PowerPoint set up here. And I'll go to slideshow mode. Let's see if that does it. Let's see. Is that working for everybody?
It's not quite where we just see one slide at a time yet.
Oh, okay. Let me get that. Hang on. I see. There we go.
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for the invitation. And Melissa and I remember very well being a part of Symposium in the late 80s, where we were really kind of everybody thrilled with this work, and caregiving was at a very early and exciting time. And Melissa's been a part of some very impactful research, including the early work you did on multiple roles of caregivers that I still have my students cite. So what I want to talk to you about today is some things we've learned about the transition to caregiving. I've studied caregiving a long time. We usually have to do this work by going out and beating the bushes for people who are caregivers, getting non-representative samples, and trying to match them up with non-caregivers who really aren't very well matched. So I've had a chance to be a part of a big project where we got around a lot of the difficulties in this field, and I'm excited to tell you about the work. So I'm going to say a little bit about the history of research focused on caregiving and well-being, and what I view as a paradigm that has really overwhelmed the field of the imperiled or doomed caregiver, largely shaped by early findings that have not been well replicated. I'll say why we think the studying transitions to caregiving is such a fruitful method, and about the particular study that I've been a part of. And really what I want us to come out of this with, hopefully, is we have a more balanced view of caregiving than is commonly presented in the literature. There are stress and negative effects, but we can see a lot of ways that caregivers show resilience and tell us that they receive benefits from being caregivers. So some early papers that I've cited here. I did a talk at Hopkins at one point about the history of caregiving research, and it was fascinating to go back to this. But in the 60s and 70s, nobody was talking about caregiving. They were instead trying to fight the idea that people wouldn't help their family members. There was this myth that families would throw their relatives into nursing homes and not show any dedication. And if you look at that early work, it's really kind of laid a groundwork, but did not focus on caregiving. Now, one of the great papers I've read in this field, and I urge everybody interested in caregiving or Alzheimer's disease to look at it, published by Fox in 1989, and it's about what he terms the rise of the Alzheimer's disease movement. So when I got started working with caregivers as a clinical psychologist in 1981, there were no Alzheimer's Association chapters, there were no self-help books that were widely available, there were no TV ads about caregiving. The DSM manual had just switched from speaking of organic brain syndrome to now speaking about dementia. So there were some very dramatic things that happened late 70s, early 80s. And I wasn't honestly aware of this history until reading the article. But some neuroscientists who were studying the pathology of cognitive impairment basically recognized that the vast majority of the dementias in older adults were due to Alzheimer's disease pathology. And they saw an opportunity there to basically make a case that Alzheimer's is not a rare pre-senile dementia only hitting young people, but an impactful disease. And it's a fascinating article that basically, I would say it was in a sense a sort of conspiracy, but a good conspiracy between these neuroscientists and people at the NIA. They needed a disease. You couldn't be a hot institute if you didn't have a disease. And Alzheimer's disease became that disease. And the Alzheimer's Association was founded out of that collaboration. So read that history. It's a fascinating story that tells us some of the story about why caregiving has become such an important topic. So, the first paper that really had a high impact here was by Steve Zaret in 1980. Now, students, this is an example. You don't have to have a massive sample of people and do complex statistics. Steve came up with a great idea, published a paper with 29 caregivers and their family members. It's utterly out of date when we look at this paper today, but he included the burden scale in that article, and caregiving research just mushroomed. And Steve deserves a lot of the credit for that, but also the context that I just mentioned was very important. So we can look before 1980. This is a Google Ngram search. You look at terms that are in books, and you can see basically the frequency with which terms are used. And you can see caregiving was not mentioned at all before 1980. Zaret didn't actually use the term caregivers himself. He said families of impaired elders, but that term took off, family caregivers and family caregiving. And I did a search on this in 2015 and projected some of what that increase had been. You can see the same things. I looked at ISI Web of Knowledge, looked at number of papers using that term. You can see there was no use of it pretty much before 1980. And I think Steve's paper really launched a massive increase in interest in this topic. So for my own seat, I got very lucky to happen into caregiving. I'm posting an old picture. Some of you might remember when I looked a little like that. But my story, and this is also for the students, I applied for 22 academic jobs and did not get one when I finished my internship in 1981. So they had an NIA postdoctoral fellow in geriatric clinical psychology, likely launched by the very efforts that I just mentioned that had happened to build up NIA. And I took that postdoc. And fortuitously, University of Washington had one of the first memory clinics in the United States, the Geriatric and Family Services Clinic. There were nothing like Alzheimer's disease centers. My first day there, my major job was to test people, give them memory testing and other cognitive testing to ascertain whether they might have dementia or normal aging or depression affecting cognitive function. We hadn't even heard or thought of MCI at that point. But I became captivated by the caregivers. They were telling these amazing stories of what their family members were doing. There was no help for them. The docs would pretty much say, we'll come back in 6 months, we'll retest and see how things are. There were no drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And I learned really quickly that it was very well within my capacity as a psychologist to help these people with very simple communication skills and reframing the way they looked at their relatives. So I got really hooked on the idea of doing research on caregiving. I moved to the University of Alabama at Birmingham in 1983, applied for a grant and got it for $40,000, which seemed like $1 million to me at the time. And I started doing clinical work a day a week at the Veterans Hospital, which was enormously useful for me because that's where I came up with the idea to study diversity in caregiving. We saw so many African-American rural caregivers in that site, and it was clear that they didn't view things at all like these affluent white families I had read about and were working about. So we got an NIA program project actually to study white and African-American caregivers starting in 1990. And we got one of the early Alzheimer's disease centers. So I moved to University of South Florida in 1995. Here's some key papers as you look at the history of caregiving. I looked up the Google Scholar citations today. It's just remarkable. Zaret's paper has over 6,500 citations. That's a career for many people. Linda George and Lisa Gwyther did a very important paper in 1986, where they made the case that burden probably isn't the only thing we ought to be studying. We ought to be studying general measures of well-being in caregivers and compare them to people who aren't caregivers to assess the magnitude of impact on public health relevant measures like health and psychological well-being. And that's been a very tough thing to do. Their early papers used convenience samples, as did mine. And so our estimates about those things were not as good as we can get today. In 1987, Jan Kiko Glazer and her crew at Ohio State started publishing on immune system effects of caregiving. And one of they've had many highly cited papers, one in 1991, over 1,400 citations. And I would note again, only 69 caregivers in that study, but made a really high impact. And another key timeline here is that in 1999, Rich Schultz and Beach published a paper in JAMA finding this remarkable finding that's captivated the field, that caregivers, spouse caregivers who reported some strain had 63% higher mortality than non-caregiving spouses. Thousands of citations. And I have to say, if any of you have ever been to an Alzheimer's Association family meeting or public talks, you'll have heard this figure miscited in 100 different ways, because it's sort of like telephone where one person hears about it. So I've heard it that 63% of people with dementia die before their caregivers, which is utterly false. But anyway, these papers have made a huge influence on our field. Here's a picture and some comments from caregiver websites. And if you look at our 2015 paper in the Gerontologist, we document where some of these come from. But caregiver websites portray an alarming view of the health risks of being a family caregiver. My colleague David Roth, who I'll say a little bit about now, he says that it's almost being compared to smoking in terms of its deadliness to people's lives. By the way, the commonly cited statement at the bottom about caregivers dying before the patient themselves, Joe Gaugler wrote a very good paper. Somebody finally had to tackle that, and he showed very clearly that's just false. And it's sort of an urban legend of caregiving. There were some early signs that the research on caregiving was maybe magnifying the effects more greatly than was appropriate. So Pinkwart and Sorensen did an early meta-analysis. They found that effect sizes for both depression and physical health were roughly twice as high among all studies as among those that used representative samples. And that's because, and I did it, you go out in the field, you go to memory clinics, you go to support groups. Who goes there? People who are distressed, right? So it's very easy to get, and I've worked as a clinical psychologist. I've had caregivers I worked with drop dead of a heart attack while I was working with them. It's very easy to see that there could be very dire negative effects, but we have to look more carefully, and population-based studies are one of the ways we can do that. So caregiving is clearly very common. The figures vary, though, a great deal. Schultz and Eden in the National Academy's report put it at 18 million caregivers for older adults, but they're using a reasonable threshold of how much care people provide. Groups like AARP, their figures are accurate, but they cite, for example, anybody who's provided any care over the previous year. So their figures are going to be much higher. But clearly caregiving is very common and can be quite impactful. And there's concerns about whether there'll be enough caregivers as a population ages. So part of our interest in this, we don't want to be issuing dire warnings to caregivers unless we're really sure that they're accurate. So as we look at the mental and physical health effects of caregiving, the conventional view is that caregiving is extremely stressful and burdensome. Caregivers are very likely to get high depression, poor health, their immune system flops, their mortality is higher. But it's increasingly being challenged, not that caregiving isn't stressful and can have ill effects, but Rachel Pruchno has shown that convenience samples are much more distressed than people you get from community samples. There are a lot of interesting articles that show that caregivers report benefits, satisfaction, growth, meaning, etc. As I'm going to show you, the latest work shows that caregivers have lower mortality than non-caregivers, not higher mortality. And biomarker studies, our work and others, suggest that there ought to be a little more skepticism about this. Here's an example of some work on the positive aspects of caregiving. The National Opinion Research Center found in 2014, 53% of Americans 40 and over have been a caregiver for a family member, but you can see somewhere over 80% say that it was a positive experience for them as they look back on it. They still note that it caused stress, but more say that it was a positive than say that it was a stress. Similarly, and I've given my slides to folks, you're welcome to have them to follow these up. The Pew Research Foundation has also noted providing care for adults is generally rated as a meaningful activity. Interestingly, even more so by people 75 plus who are providing care. So it can be a fulfilling role. We found in a study we published in the journal Stroke that caregivers do report, stroke caregivers report common problems, but they also report very much using a scale that measures positive aspects of caregiving. Over 90% say being a caregiver enabled them to appreciate life more. 88% said it made them feel needed, etc. So besides the concerns about caregiving, we do need to acknowledge it can be a very fulfilling role to people. This is a great paper that I don't know if it's getting enough attention. Jennifer Wolfe at Hopkins published this in 2017, and she's very carefully shown that actually caregivers reporting distress has declined in recent years. And she looked at this very carefully from 1999 to 2015 data sets, lower levels of emotional strain, physical strain, financial strain, and higher use of respite. That's not news we hear very often. We don't say much about, we hear about the impending doom of the tsunami of older adults, but we've done some things right. We've gotten information out about caregiving. It's now widely understood and there are many more supports available. So I want to acknowledge my colleague, both of us were a little younger in this picture, David Roth. David and I were both at UAB in 1991 when I got my first grant. At that time, he just came on as a statistician and a very good one. But when I moved to USF, he took over as PI in my absence, and he remained behind at UAB. And we got the opportunity through him being there for a tremendous chance of being a part of a major epidemiological study based at UAB. And we published over 40 papers together. And I'll note David is this year's recipient of the Powell Lawton Applied Gerontology Research Award, and that's a very well-deserved award. I nominated him for it. So we connected with the REGARD study, which was based at UAB. They were interested in stroke epidemiology, so they got this massive grant to recruit over 30,000 people 45 and over. Because of their interest in stroke, they oversampled the stroke belt in the Deep South, and they oversampled Black or African American participants. And so we have over 30,000 people who we were able to get some questions in on caregiving right from the start. So we've been able to track some information about caregiving over time in this tremendous study. So 12% of that sample, 45 plus, were caregivers at the time of enrollment. This study is just astonishing. Besides getting telephone interviews, they send nurses into homes. There's a company they've contracted to do that. They weigh them, they take their blood pressure, they take blood measures, they do all sorts of biometric measures of them, and then they interview them every 6 months about a multitude of things. So this is a tremendous database. So we have all the advantages of being a part of a population-based study, but we've been able to infuse our own questions into this project from the very beginning. So here's acknowledgement of the grant support that we've had and that UAB has had. David Roth has been PI because he was at UAB, but we've partnered very closely. And I'll tell you about a subsequent study funded in 2016. So our early work focused on stroke caregiving. We've moved to a broader set of work since then. So as I mentioned, their goal is to identify the causes of stroke, the differential mortality and rates in Blacks and whites. They're looking at diet, they're looking at air pollution, they're looking at all sorts of data, from zip code information that they have. What an amazing study. And there, I think we're at one time up to 50 ancillary studies to regards, tapping these data to study kidney function, cognition, etc. So we have both studied regards participants as caregivers and as people who, when they had strokes, we recruited their caregivers from their families. So here's the question we asked. We were aiming for a broad definition, not just somebody who's occasionally provided care, but they're providing continuous care for a person with chronic illness and disability. And at the baseline, 12% said they had. Most live with the care recipient. Most were spouse caregivers. Most are doing 10 hours a week or more of care. Interestingly, only 18% report a lot of strain. Now, we got this question exactly from Rich Schultz's caregiving and mortality paper, because we hope to, he had found that reports of strain using the simple scale were important. And interestingly, if you look at Rich's work, I think they've only got about 33% who report high strain in that study. So among general populations, caregiving is generally not viewed as extremely stressful. We had measures at the baseline of depression score, the SF-12, which measures mental health and physical health quality of life. And not surprising, given the large sample sizes, the caregivers had higher levels of depression and mental health problems. Note, though, these are small effect sizes, 0.13 and 0.18. And even with over 30,000 people, the effect size for physical health is not significant. So no indication in this sample of broad caregivers who are, maybe not doing a lot of care, that their health is having a negative impact. When you look within those data at that paper we published in Quality of Life Research, you see the Schultz item on strain works very well. People who report no strain and moderate strain report no significant increase in depressive symptoms. But caregivers who report high strain report much higher. And I've suggested in clinical settings, we ought to use this simple strain indicator as a very practical measure of risk for negative caregiver outcomes. So when you look at a broad definition of caregivers like this, most don't report strain. The psychological distress effects are small, but they're important, and no significant effects for health quality of life. So we have been looking at this literature, and we think the typical way, we go out and beat the bushes for caregivers who are atypical. We beat the bushes for controls who are also not typical. They're volunteers, nice people who help us. So we've decided what we needed to do was to identify people who transition into caregiving, and also into what we've said, substantial and sustained caregiving. If we want to see if caregiving has ill effects on, your inflammation and immune system and telomere length, we don't want to do that with people who are just doing occasional caregiving. Let's make sure they have a substantial exposure. We also ought to know whether they're doing dementia caregiving. We need to study well-being, indicators of health, and biomarkers, because biomarkers have been a really exciting scientific idea. And then we need non-caregiving controls who don't transition. Well, we were set beautifully to do that because we had a big sample of people who were not caregivers at the beginning of the caregiving of the regard study. So what we've done, we've studied changes over 2 blood draws in biomarkers of inflammation, telomere length. We've got things like blood glucose, we've got lipids, we've got all sorts of stuff we barely begin to touch. And so they're carefully matched. And so we don't just study people after they become caregivers, we had data on them in advance and then see how things changed after a transition. And so this allows us to measure the magnitude of change due to just to caregiving beyond aging and other factors. So here's a paper we outlined the methods, which are quite complex. Again, we're funded, this one was funded by the NRIA from 2016 to 2021. We haven't been able to get all our work done, but we've got a lot of nice papers out of this and we're working on more. It's a multi-site project, such a cool thing to be a part of. At Vermont, they have a huge warehouse full of freezers that stores blood across this study and other studies. They can go back and tap that blood and get, telomere length from 10 years ago. And as long as we can pay for those analyses, and just tremendous scholars. I'll note Jeremy Walston, one of the leading geriatricians who studied frailty and, biomarkers of frailty. So the eligibility criteria are rather complex, and I won't go through all of them in detail, but they all had to be at the regard study and not a caregiver initially. To be a caregiver, they had to have at least 6 months of caregiving before the second blood draw that was done about 10 years after the first one. And they had to have been caregiving for at least 6 months after a follow-up phone call we did a couple of years after that to get detail on them. They had to care for an adult care recipient at least 5 hours a week of unpaid care, live within 50 miles, and they had to have the blood assays because we really wanted to look at these biomarker issues. These non-caregivers, they haven't done any caregiving beyond a couple of weeks during that period. They're matched on a number of variables. Because we had such a big population, we could very carefully match on a number of indicators, person to person. If they're matched to a spouse, they had to be married. If they were matched to an adult child, that adult child had to have a living parent. So to show you in a timeline, and I know this is complex, Regards first did a CADI, computer-assisted telephone interview around 2004 to 2007. They had an in-home visit right after that where they drew blood, et cetera. Transitions to caregiving could have occurred at any time during this interval. Then Regards did a second in-home visit, somewhere in this range. We did our screening sometime after that. And then we did a subsequent interview beyond the screening to see whether they met those very tight eligibility criteria. So there were thousands of calls made, and the Regards people, they've got a call bank set up, such pros. They get down to business, they call hundreds of people a day, a big bank of people, very reliable approach to interviewing. They keep immaculate data, just great people to work with. I'll never do amateur data collection myself. Like when, if you have a shop like this, boy, use them. And here's a more detailed figure. You can see of the people who are initially non-caregivers, over 10,000 had not become a caregiver. 1,229 had become caregivers, but of those, only 251 met these really tight criteria we set out, because we didn't want people who had just occasionally provided care or hadn't been doing it on an ongoing basis. We didn't want to, for example, not find biomarker differences and have people say, well, they really weren't doing much care. What are you going to expect? So we tried to be very rigorous with that. And it was a tough job, but we were able to get 251 caregivers who met our criteria. And then because we had 10,000 non-caregivers to match from, pretty easy to get very, accurately matched non-caregivers. Now, for these caregivers, if you look up top, they're perfectly matched on things like race and gender because we matched them. They're doing a lot of care. They're providing over 40 hours a week on average. and their duration of care at the first assessment, 5.75 years. So they're doing major caregiving. They're certainly not people just doing intermittent care. So our first major paper to come out was published in JAGS in 2020, looking at changes in caregiver well-being and compared to the matched controls. So basically we had 4 measures: the perceived stress scale, a short form of the CESD, the 12-item SF12 with mental health and physical health scores. Those of you who've used it know higher scores are better. So we were very interested in effect sizes because we want to see, this is a better way to gauge the impact of taking on caregiving than just cross-sectional comparisons. And then we were also interested, not just if there's a main effect for change in caregiving, because we certainly expected that, but are there moderator effects for sex, race, age, and relationship? So most studies show that women have more distress after caregiving, that whites show more distress than Blacks or African Americans. Older caregivers have more distress, and spouses. But we're looking at something different here. We can look at, for example, whether women show greater increases over time after becoming caregivers. That makes sense? So it allows us to really see whether which groups are vulnerable. So here's the regression model. You'll have to, I'm not going to be able to go this quickly, but I wanted to show people roughly what we do. There's, first of all, covariates entered for baseline score on, say, the perceived stress score, and then whether there's a caregiver effect on a change score. So it's change over time. And of course, there's a very significant effect for caregivers showing higher perceived stress, no effect for age or sex. There is a race effect, and that race effect is actually that Black participants showed declines in perceived stress over time compared to white participants. Then we ran moderator effects, which are not shown here, as I described. So here's the figure that JAGS puts things on Twitter, and they want a simple figure, and it's actually a figure that shows this very nicely. These are the effect sizes in terms of the fraction of a standard deviation. Caregivers show massive worsening of CESD. Non-caregivers, no, that's just perceived stress, I'm sorry. Non-caregivers showed declines in perceived stress. That's interesting. Older adults in this longitudinal study report declined perceived stress. So the effect size is basically the sum of those 2 effects. Same for depression, much higher rates in the caregivers and small declines in CESD. For psychological distress on a quality of life measure, the caregivers do much worse. The controls do better over time. Now, this is an interesting effect for physical quality of life. The caregivers show a greater decline than the non-caregivers, but they're all growing older, right? So the controls are also showing declines in their health-related quality of life. And this is why we think it's so important to have careful non-caregiving controls, because otherwise you could think this is a much bigger change in health due to caregiving when it's really likely an age effect. Now note these effect sizes are really big, and they're bigger than what people have typically estimated, but that's because we did this so carefully to monitor change over time, and they've all gone to doing, substantial and sustained care. Note that the effect size for physical health is on the small side. So that doesn't mean there's not a change, it's significant, but it's much smaller than what we see for psychological distress. So the 16 moderator effects we ran, only 1 came out, and I'll show you the figure on that. So there was no evidence that, say, women got more distressed when they became caregivers than men, that whites became more distressed, that people who were spouses became more distressed. None of that worked out for any of the 4 outcomes. Very interesting age by caregiver effect that I'll show you. There's some interesting dual main effects that I'll also show you one example of. So here's our moderator effect. Controls show pretty much no change, and that doesn't matter by age. Now, interestingly, for younger caregivers who in this sample, when they were split, they're about 64 on average, they show higher increases in depression than do those who are around 80 on average, and this is at the post-test. So you could speculate a lot about why this might be. Same thing has been found in some studies of natural disasters, for example. Younger people have more other roles that they're involved in. It's harder for them to take care of things. Older people, it's more expected in the life course, et cetera. So that's a really interesting effect, but we don't have much to say about why that's occurring at this point. And here's an example of one of these dual effects, two main effects. So the 64-year-old controls on physical health, quality of life are pretty much showing us no change. The 64-year-old caregivers, you can see, are showing somewhat of a decline. 80-year-old controls showing some decline. It's an additive effect to age, is a way to think about it. So we've also found, I'm not showing you a lot of results. We published a paper in the Gerontologist. Dementia caregivers report greater distress and they're doing more caregiving, et cetera. If you adjust for how many problems their relative has, the differences in distress are no longer significant. So we can explain, statistically at least, the greater distress of dementia caregivers by the relatives are more impaired. And you can look at that paper more closely if you care to see that effect. Now, biomarkers. We'll get something in about that. So when you read the literature reviews, it's very much a matter of who's a fan and who isn't. So we found 2 reviews that say, oh, this is very clear. There's dysregulation in caregivers. 2 other reviews say the results are inconsistent. We don't really see much. These are narrative reviews, right? So we decided while we're waiting for our data to cook, we would do a systematic review in our spare time. So we did that. And David Roth led this. We only found 30 studies that had compared caregivers and non-caregivers on biomarkers of inflammation and immunity. Only 3 of them were population-based. And Ken, your crew gets some help, some applause for that. You did one of them. You also did one of only 6 studies that had over 100 people. I have to say, digging into this literature, I was shocked because I'd always been kind of a true believer. I put it in my grant proposals, about how caregiving was, making people die faster and it was wrecking their immune systems. When we do this systematic review, we find it's a very small effect size, 0.16 standard deviation units. That only accounts for 1% of variance in the immunity measures. By contrast, for example, C-reactive protein, an important inflammation measure, 13% of that variance is accounted for by obesity. So we're talking about if there are effects there, they're pretty small. We also found the highest quality studies had the lowest effect sizes. Not a good sign for that being a really robust effects. Any of you are not familiar with John Ioannidis? What a brilliant scholar. And he's done a series of papers, including about biomarkers, where he shows, in essence, that the most widely cited papers in fields, that he did it for inflammation or for biomarkers here, are often way out of line with what we find when we actually eventually do a meta-analysis. They grossly exaggerate the effect. And there's probably a lot of complex reasons we could talk about why that happens. But, like I'm going to show you in the mortality papers, there's a bunch of papers finding lower mortality among caregiving. They're cited rarely. Schultz and Beach is cited thousands of times. An early, impactful, high-impact study has an an unfair and unreasonable effect on the way people view a field. So we have a cool variety of biomarkers that we mainly picked these because they were found in the literature and in prior papers. So we have these pre-post. We also have these pre-post, but I don't have final papers for you. I will give a little hint. We've got our telomere paper out under review. No change in telomere length for caregivers as compared to non-caregivers over time. We haven't been able to get that one published yet. We published our paper on inflammation. We were very excited to get it published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They'd published a number of the hallmark studies showing inflammation and also telomere changes in caregivers. But basically, Only one of the 6 measures showed a significant change. It's a small effect size. And basically the idea, this is consistent with the meta-analysis. If there's a signal there, it's very small and we're not able to detect it in a very large study, followed over a long period of time where the people are doing very substantial levels of caregiving and are quite psychologically distressed. Now let's speak about mortality. Rich Schultz is a good friend and I've known him for years. He published this great paper, more power to him, but it hasn't been replicated. We did a paper in 2013. I remember sitting with David Roth when the analyses were being done, he was doing them. And we get these shocking results to me because I hadn't looked at the mortality data before. The caregivers show slower or higher rates of survival over time than do regards non-caregivers as a whole. And they even show they show greater survival than carefully matched, propensity matched non-caregivers. And so honest, David and I sat and we did like a dozen different post hoc analyses to see, well, maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe the spouse caregivers they're dying faster, or maybe it's the spouse caregivers who live alone. We report those in this 2013 paper, but basically the effect is not there. They're not, the caregivers are dying more slowly. They're not dying faster. Now, Schultz only followed folks for 4 years. He had a much smaller sample. They were a more frail sample than ours, but we have a great variability on that. And so many other people, as I'll show you, have found what we have, and we weren't the first, that caregivers actually live longer than non-caregivers. These findings are international. They use different methods. They use different data sets. And they find a robust finding about 14 to 18% lower mortality in caregivers. So we wrote a paper in 2015 that's honestly one of the best papers I've ever been a part of, where we said that we thought that we needed a new narrative about caregiving, that the negative results are so slanting the field. So Schultz and Beach, what we did was develop this this figure here that shows in dark bold the overall effect for caregiver versus non-caregiver across the 6 studies we could find to date. So Schultz originally, he reported caregivers who reported stress versus non-caregivers, and that effect was significant. Now, I got to say the confidence interval touches 1.0. So they made that effect by the barest of margins. But David did a calculation. If you look at all caregivers versus all non-caregivers, that effect is no longer statistically significant. People widely miscite this and they say that Schultz found that caregivers have higher mortality. No, he didn't. And in fact, I've even heard it, people say, well, dementia caregivers. No, he didn't study dementia caregivers. So all the subsequent studies, if you look at the bold lines, find caregivers have a main effect of lower mortality. It's in a 14 to 18% range than non-caregivers. And if the smaller, lighter colored hash lines are subgroup analyses, you see on none of them is there a major effect of higher mortality. So for example, in our group, this might have been co-residing spouses, I think. So, but the confidence intervals are wide because they've got small numbers. So look at that really carefully. And I have to say, the evidence looks pretty compelling to me. And there's a recent meta-analysis that's found other papers that caregivers do not have increased mortality. It's just not there. Now, we published a paper in Psychology and Aging in 2018, and we invited Stephanie Brown at Stony Brook to co-author with us. She's done some fascinating work, and she's proposed that there's actually a caregiving system that's built within us biologically and that has evolved that makes us basically sympathetic to our loved ones having distress, and that we can do something to care for them. It may set off a series of hormonal responses. Read the paper, I can't explain the biology of it, but she believes that we're biologically protected to some extent by providing caregivers. And sure enough, David came up with this prediction theoretically, and we invited Stephanie to join us. But what we found, we had baseline measures of depression and perceived stress, and there's a huge literature showing that those factors are related to increased mortality. So we looked at that carefully, and if you read the paper, we eventually separated out. For non-caregivers, those two variables lead to a 21% increase in mortality over time. For caregivers, there's no significant relationship between depressive symptoms, perceived stress, and ultimate mortality. The person who can figure out why that's happened, that's a Nobel Prize winner. I think, to me, we think it's likely that caregivers feel satisfaction from care. It gives their life meaning, that it may keep them physically active and engaged. It engages them with others. So we have a really interesting effect that if somebody wants to make a scientific name for themselves, see if you can figure this one out. So basically what I would say here, we have, very good evidence that caregivers, non-representative samples using not using non-caregiving controls, if you're not assuring that they're doing substantial and sustained caregiving, or if you're using things like retrospective changes in health, you not likely to find some of these important effects we're talking about. Now, for caregivers who provide substantial and sustained care, they show substantial declines in well-being. So there's no doubt about that. Pretty small declines in health-rated quality of life. And we're not detecting a signal in inflammation or in telomere length, which the studies on that have been, those are been in a newspaper. They're in a newspaper, even though they were done many years ago, every time somebody writes about caregiving. So we think that it's very unlikely that the dire narrative about caregiving that we often see on websites or sometimes in our own grant proposals or papers, that those are really accurate. We found that caregiver advocacy groups have not wanted to change their message. And in fact, we had a New York Times story about our 1983 paper, and we had some really tough pushback from people saying, what are you saying? Caregivers don't need help? And, just because, so we had some real tough feedback, pushback on that. And we never said anything like that, but we don't need to exaggerate risks of death, for example, to say that caregivers need help. So the caregiver web pages largely haven't changed what they put up about this. We've got analyses underway that are exciting. We're looking at caregiving, and I mentioned telomere length, cholesterol, blood sugar. We're looking at individual differences in how much stress people perceive, how much caregiving they do, et cetera, seeing whether that predicts changes in biomarkers. But ultimately, what this results make us think, we need a more balanced narrative about caregiving. And I'm afraid I left out a few slides I'd wanted to present about caregiving and benefits. Any of you who are interested, I've got a few slides that somehow I didn't get in there in this version, but there's a lot of evidence. Over 80% of caregivers report that they've had some, did I present those? Maybe I did get them in. Over 80% of caregivers report that they have benefits. Yeah, I did report it. I'm sorry, I'm thinking too fast here. But people do report benefits of caregiving. And so we need a narrative that doesn't scare caregivers away and say, this is like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, you're risking your health. So caregiving is stressful and caregivers need help. But there are benefits. Actually, an exciting line of work I'd urge any of you to read who are interested in this. Tak Cheng is at University of Hong Kong, has developed a caregiver intervention that adds benefit finding to the caregiver intervention beyond standard psychoeducation. He finds it's more effective than standard psychoeducation. So helping caregivers to see, for example, the little ways that what they've done is raise their quality of life for their relative, or to think about how grateful they'll be. I know in my own family, we're so grateful we took care of our mom when she was sick and provided that care for her. And years later, that's providing us a comfort. So we have to find a way to think about those things in a more balanced manner. So let me stop there, and I'm glad to take, I've sent my PowerPoint to you. I'm glad to take questions and comments. And if you want reprints of individual papers as well. So thank you very much, and let me know if you have questions or comments.
Bill, that was a fabulous presentation. Thank
Thanks,
you
Ken.
so
Appreciate
much.
it.
That's an eye opener. You've dispelled some myths, and I'm sure that we have some questions. Again, we're going to do the questions through the chat. So if you see the chat where it says type message here, you can type in your message there, and then above, just send it to Paige Ebner. And so Paige is hosting the meeting, and she will cue these so that we can get those questions to Bill. Paige, do you have any questions?
I do. How do socioeconomic inequalities play a role in this transition?
Well, that's a great question. It's among the variables that we have not examined. So, we had 5 years of funding. It took a long time to collect the data. We don't have all of it. The data set is ripe for the picking on that because we do have information on education. We even have indication. One of our, a student at University of Michigan did a paper, not with the transitions data, but with other data in regards. They have neighborhood data, for example, neighborhood socioeconomic status. And she found that, for example, after stroke, higher SES neighborhoods were associated with better stroke recovery. So those effects may well be there. We have adjusted statistically for education, but we have not looked in depth at that. Now, I will note in our prior papers, we've published a number of papers and a meta-analysis that shows that Black dementia caregivers generally show less distress than white dementia caregivers. We just published a recent meta-analysis documenting that effect, and that's despite the socioeconomic disadvantages. So socioeconomics can be very important, but culture is also important, and the support that people receive. But we haven't looked at that. It would be a great thing to do in this data set.
Okay, second question. What kinds of support have been found to mitigate the psychological impacts of caregiving, like depression?
So again, we haven't analyzed that in this data set, but we've done a lot of work on that in the past. And one of the projects I was really excited to be a part of was the NYU caregiving study. We worked with Mary Middleman, and David put his statistical wonders to work on that. And in the NYU project, they actually, besides educating the caregiver, they had 4 family therapy sessions that actually push the caregiver, the family members, to help more, okay, and to provide more assistance for the caregivers. And I've met the social workers who did this intervention, very tough, very insistent. They would have harangued these family members really heavily to help more. If you read about the NYU study, that's sort of a story behind the story. But David was lead author on a mediation analysis we did on the benefits in improving caregiver depression of that NYU caregiving study. It was published somewhere around maybe 2012. Anyone who's interested can email me, or you'd find it very readily. David is the lead author. And we found that the most important mediator of improvement in caregiver depression, it turns out that they did get more assistance from family members than people who were in the control group. But the mediator was their subjective appraisal of how much families, how satisfied they were with family support. So I think that's the strongest evidence I'm aware of, that actually modifying family support and doing so as a major part of intervention, and actually like getting people to come in and get their hands dirty and do more assistance, is a very potent way to provide support. Now, people have looked at all sorts of other kinds of support. Those are generally associated with better caregiver well-being, particularly subjective measures of support. So it's not so much how many times a day people come to visit, or how many visits you have, or how many calls. It's subjective satisfaction. And we do think those things are very important.
Okay, I have seen findings suggesting that caregivers are at elevated risk for leaving the labor force early, which raises risk for poverty later on. Have you seen anything related to employment in your data?
So we haven't looked at that in our data. We have an older sample, most of whom are not employed. We do have a paper out under review from our earlier stroke work, where we look at caregivers both leaving the workforce and how being in the workforce affects their circumstance of stress. I just had a student do a fantastic dissertation on employment and caregiving, and this is a really exciting area to study. And in part, what's exciting is to look at people leaving the workforce, and that's a real problem. Businesses are going to have to step up to retain their workforce, right? We provide childcare to keep people in the workforce. Why can't we provide supports for care for older adults? Ken mentioned HR departments getting interested in this. This is going to be a key to the future. Now, one of the interesting things that my PhD student found, we were interested in race and ethnicity, and we found that Black caregivers, she looked at discrimination. One of the major stresses they report in their lives, which shouldn't be too surprising, is discrimination. And people who are Blacks who are caregivers report higher levels of experiences of discrimination than Blacks who are not caregivers. We don't quite understand that effect, but and any of you, if you look at this year's Alzheimer's Association report, they have a fabulous section on race, ethnicity, discrimination, bias and discrimination. And they've done some fascinating primary data collection where they document caregivers reporting not just job discrimination, but discrimination in healthcare and in other settings. So this is an untouched angle. And it's one of the things that's exciting to me about caregiving. It really touches on about every social and psychological issue we face. So of course I see it through that frame because it's what I do. But just, I agree, we are putting a generation of particularly women at risk of being knocked out of the employment market because of their caregiving obligations, and we've got to do a better job with it.
Does stress on the caregiver vary due to the disability or disease of the person they are caring for? For example, a wheelchair-bound person versus a patient with dementia.
So the general lore in the field is that dementia caregiving is by far the most stressful form of caregiving, but I have some doubts about that. So for example, we've studied hospice caregivers who are caring for a person either with dementia or lung cancer. Dementia and lung cancer have exactly opposite, trajectories and sets of symptoms. But we found among hospice caregivers who have really intense care provision needs that dementia caregivers and cancer caregivers did not differ in their self-reported health, their depressive symptoms, et cetera. So one of the problems, like there's a great paper by Marcia Ori and Rich Schultz and others about dementia, non-dementia caregiving, but they generally fail, and they find higher distress in dementia caregivers, but they don't control for the amount of care that's provided and the amount of impairment. So I personally am rather skeptical. We've done some work with cancer caregiving. That can be a very distressing form of care. And so I basically think that, there's some commonalities to caregiving, but any disease where you see the decline of a relative, the suffering of a relative, that Rich Schultz, I want to give him a pat on the back here. He did a great paper about suffering as a way we ought to think about what caregiving is about. It's not just how many ADLs we take care of. We've sort of resorted to that as a way of measuring it, but you're seeing a loved one decline in front of your face. You're seeing them lose their abilities. They don't recognize you. They lose their dignity to some extent. And so I think we need and we've used some work on following on Rich's work on suffering and caregiving. It does predict, for example, bereavement responses, the suffering experiences that people noted, and people will ruminate about those. But I've done some work with colleagues. We've done stroke work, we've done spinal cord injury, adult caregivers of people with intellectual disabilities. Each have their own challenges. So I kind of think of it as not just being like a scorecard of which is more stressful. You have to look at the individual stressors that each illness entails and how prepare. We know from the stress and coping theory that I use, Lazarus and Folkman, it's really a combination of stressors and resources. If you have internal resources like knowledge about the illness, education, you have problem-solving skills, and if you have external resources, you have services, you have family helping you, you have money to pay for things. If you have internal and external resources, you can manage stress. And so that includes social supports, it includes services, it includes knowledge. You know, honestly, we view in our studies of African American caregivers, they often have tremendous internal resources they've built through, like, growing up through segregation. We saw that in our Birmingham research. People told us, you know, caring for their mom was a joy. They had to pay to care for white people, you know, who were paying them minimal amounts. So these things are really tough for us to sort of gauge. And I guess I'd say we could kind of maybe make some generalizations, more impairment, more distress in the caregiver, but there's a lot of shades to this.
Okay, next question. Might the greater increase in stress experienced by younger caregivers be accounted for by their higher likelihood of having competing role responsibilities, such as employment, raising, or helping with young grandchildren, etc.?
I agree entirely. That's a great comment and question. And in our JAGS paper, we actually cite research about that on hurricanes and natural disasters, where they note those very effects. So young, like for example, and it's really clear in older hurricanes, they can take off time and make sure somebody's there to get their house repaired. If you're employed and you're running kids around, it's very challenging. So I agree that's very likely to be the case. We haven't had the chance to dig into those results, and honestly, we don't have indicators of all those things, but I believe that's very interesting. I find that effect so important because our usual attitude is as people get older, they become frail, they can't cope. Well, we're seeing quite the opposite here. And I think it's important that we get that out there to fight ageism in our field. But yeah, younger caregivers do face some different challenges. I'm in my 60s myself. We're taking care of a granddaughter, pretty much raising her much of the time. My adult children need my help. You know, so I do have, you know, we have multiple roles in our lives that can make it very challenging.
Please discuss any work that explores both the caregiver and care recipient and/or their relationship dynamics.
Boy, that is a great topic. It's not something I have done much with because in my early career, I focused so much on dementia caregiving, where we didn't really have good ways to understand, particularly with severely impaired people, their views of the relationship. But I'm very impressed by work that does try to use the actor-partner, you know, model, for example, to look at these issues. There are some great studies done with dyadic analyses that look at this. I will point you toward, now let me make sure I get her name right. Louise Hockley at one of the, I forget which Chicago university, either Rush or University of Chicago or Northwestern, but she just published a great paper in Psychology and Aging that used dyadic analyses. So it's not something I have done much with. I don't doubt for a moment that it's quite important and that it's very, you know, very fruitful, but we haven't done it.
Okay, this is the last question. Theories/perspectives that focus on caregiving burden or strain are not well situated for explaining how caregiving can have neutral or positive effects. Is there a theory that recognizes the potential benefits of caregiving that the field is beginning to embrace?
Well, first of all, I would challenge the idea that some conventional theories can't explain positive or neutral aspects, and I'll say a little about that. But I do want to note that Lisa Fredman has advanced what she calls the healthy caregiver hypothesis. And that hypothesis, both the one part that's gotten a lot of attention is that maybe caregiving attracts healthier people. But the other part that people have often missed is that caregiving may have health promoting benefits. And some of her work actually shows lower levels of frailty in people who provide higher levels of care. Now, Lazarus's stress and coping theory, and especially if you look at Susan Folkman's modification of that. She wrote a theoretical update of Lazarus and Folkman's theory. She actually specifically says that benefit finding can be one of the assets in adaptive coping with stress. And the other thing I would note, I've actually got a figure I showed when I speak to clinical groups. You can think of stress and coping as a balance beam, okay? If you have lots of stress and very few resources, people are going to be very distressed. But if you have lots of stress and you have tons of resources, if you have more resources than you have stressors, if that makes sense, then you can prosper with stressful things like caregiving or other, there's all sorts of people who study things like post-traumatic growth. So to me, Lazarus and Folkman's theory accommodates that very nicely, particularly if you look at what has been done by Susan Folkman to modify that and to point out benefit finding as a sort of internal resource that people can use. So if you have enough internal and external resources, caregiving can be, not that it's a dream, right? It's no fun to see a relative decline and to have to provide care for them. But if you have people helping you and you have the right equipment, and I see someone comments about family stress theory. So it's probably quite similar. But if you have lots of external resources and internal resources, I remember when I worked at UAB and we did one of our intervention studies, I had an affluent caregiver who had also been a nurse. She actually built a wing onto her house to care for her mother. And she hired a full-time nurse because they had the assets to do it. But she also had a nursing background herself, right? So she had the resources to make that far less challenging than a person who's on their own, doesn't know anything about it. And so I think you can use those theories, and Folkman has done that beautifully. And thanks for the mention of family stress theory.
Bill, again, I want to thank you. I feel like you need to take a breath. You did a magnificent job responding to those questions, and boy, did we get some great questions. So,
well, Ken, I love speaking to groups like this, and I've been doing this work a long time. It's so exciting to do a project to this magnitude. This is the kind of thing you draw up on the chalkboard in the methods class of what you might do, and we got to do it. So anyway, thanks for having me here. And you have a great crew of people you had asking good questions.
Oh, good. I'm glad it worked out, but you really appreciate your help.
Sure.
We want to transition to something that we do at each fall symposium, where we give an award to scholars who have done exceptional work. The award rotates each year from research to teaching to engagement. Last year, David Waters was recognized for his exceptional performance in the classroom and mentoring. He teaches our biology of aging class. Today, we're going to focus on engagement, exceptional engagement. And I usually like to think of having one winner for these awards, but we had just a remarkable, absolutely remarkable set of nominations. And the committee labored at length to try to come up with one, and they decided that they wanted to have co-winners, and I endorsed that with enthusiasm. Both of these winners are people who are exceptional at research. They're magnificent in the classroom and mentoring, and they also have this work of engagement. So they, by analogy, they're sort of the academic triathlete. They can do it in many different ways. Another kind of interesting thing about the two of them is they both got their PhDs from Penn State University. So it's almost like you can hear now the Nittany lion crying in the back, or howling in the back. But we're very excited about these two. So let me introduce each one of them, and then after I'm done, then they will have an opportunity to make some comments. So first up is Reagan Bailey, who is professor of nutrition science at Purdue and director of the Purdue Diet Assessment Center. I see Reagan's work as a nutritional epidemiologist as really avant-garde. She worked these last few years as part of the US Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And for anyone who knows anything about that, that's a lot of work. It's not one of these things where they just put you on this committee and you get to advise out of your great wisdom. You actually have to do research on that committee. And so she, represented Purdue very well there in that role. She also is on the board of trustees of the International Food Information Council, which is an exceptional role. And she's a co-investigator on a USAID Feed the Future project. So her work influences not only US policy, but she's actually working on issues of nutritional adequacy in places like Senegal and Kenya and Africa. Reagan Bailey also had a banner 2020 year. She was named to the National Academy of Medicine. That is a singular honor, and we're so proud of her. So let me just say thank you to Reagan and congratulations. We are pleased to honor you today. Secondly, let me introduce Shelley McDermott Wadsworth. Shelley is the Distinguished Professor of Human Development and Family Studies at Purdue. She's the director of the Center for Families. She's the director of the Military Family Research Institute, and she's the executive director of the Family Impact Institute. I know you already have a question. How does she do it? Well, Shelley has remarkable interest and creativity. She's the kind of a person who's really zeroed in on this issue of work-family balance. She studies work conditions and family life, and so quite appropriate for the topic we're discussing today. Her work on developing this Military Family Research Institute was another remarkable thing. And in that, you see these outreach activities to the community. So again, it's this combination of scholarship, teaching students and mentoring students in that work, but also reaching out to people in need. She is an exemplar of life course analysis. She studies families at various stages and how they're adapting to the needs of their kin. So some of her work focuses on childhood, some of focuses on later life. Faced with a pandemic, Shelley spearheaded an initiative called Families Tackling Tough Times Together, which focused on how it is that families can deal with hard times. A pandemic is one of them, but it's really how to get assistance in a 10-week or 10-session advising and counseling measure. She does so many things that I find remarkable, but the engagement career for Shelley really is not a substitute for her scholarship. It's rather an extension. And if I could use an analogy to just say what I really appreciate is that like a golfer or a baseball player or a tennis player, you have to swing through. And Shelley does the research, but she doesn't stop with just doing the research. She takes it and follows through on that swing and makes sure that her work has a public policy or practical impact. And for that, we're very grateful. So congratulations, Shelley. So now let's take a couple of minutes and have some comments from our awardees. Exceptional Engagement Award to Reagan Bailey. Reagan?
Ken, thank you so much for this recognition. So service is so important to the work that we all do, but it's really often overlooked and underappreciated. So I'm grateful to you and to CALC for creating an award that showcases this aspect of our careers. So when I came to Purdue in 2015, I think Ken was the first person to reach out to me and invite me to be a part of the center. And he immediately made me feel included and valued here. It's especially nice to share this award with Shelley, whom I met early on in the community, actually at a wine tasting event. And she was so warm and kind. I had no idea how famous she was, that she was the director of 5 institutes, because that night she was just Shelley. And so I felt included both in the community and at the university by these special people. So this is a nice honor for me. And I think last year I was able to share the service work that I did for the guidelines committee with you as part of the seminar series. So I won't say much else other than to say that I'm really deeply appreciative for this award and for being a part of this group.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Shelley, could we hear a few comments from you? You're muted.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted all the necessary places, but not. First, I really want to say thank you to the review committee. I know that it's a lot of work to do this, and I had no idea I was being considered, so it makes it extra special. And I also want to just take a moment to express my appreciation for Ken. I know, Ken, that you recently announced that you're going to be transitioning to a different faculty role, and I just have so appreciated over the years your counsel and also your example. You and I have met numerous times for me to seek your guidance, and I've always just been so grateful, and I've learned so much from watching you do your work. When you were reflecting about engagement, and Reagan, your comments too made me think that for much of my career, I felt that my engagement work was sort of tolerated as opposed to celebrated. You know, I had that weird engagement gene that always wanted me to have one foot off campus, and the world has really changed. And now I'm running to keep up with all of these people who do this new thing. Well, not so new now, but now it's implementation science. I had no idea. And so it's really been fun to see that change happen. And I was having little flashbacks about Steve Zarrett, because he was on the faculty at Penn State when I was in graduate school. This initiative, Families Tackling Tough Times Together, was a real joy to take on during the pandemic. And I felt that it tapped into so much of what our faculty, staff, and students wanted to do, which was to try to help others during a very difficult time for themselves and others. And so my name is on this, but really it was a team of 70 faculty, staff, and students who came together rapidly and designed and implemented in 23 days an initiative to try to help families sustain and grow their resilience during a pandemic. And then a bunch of organizations joined on as well. So it was a really ambitious, but also rewarding scientific enterprise. And for us, I think a very fulfilling way to try to help families capitalize on the strengths that we know they all have. So I greatly appreciate the recognition, and I especially appreciate it because we did try so hard to be inclusive of families with members of different ages and abilities. And to have this group acknowledge that is even more special. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate it.
You are most welcome. This is one of the hard things about the pandemic time, because we'd really like to shake your hand or give you a hug and congratulate both of you, but it's just going to have to be a virtual hug, and congratulations to both of you. I think it's been a great morning. I appreciate all of you attending and the superb questions. Thanks again to Bill Haley for just a magnificent lecture and response to questions. We have our next colloquium on October 15th, where we will be hearing from Lisa Barnes, who's at Rush University Medical Center, on basically epidemiology of Alzheimer's disease and dementia in diverse audiences. So I think that event will flow nicely from this one. I want to thank you for attending and wish you a good day.